All right, so we are on week 5 in our sermon series on the Prodigal Son. And this morning, or as I've encouraged you to do over the last few weeks, is to put yourself in the sandals or in the shoes of each one of the characters that we've talked about. And so in the first 2 weeks, we spent time looking at the younger son and some of the ways we might understand that character. And then in the last 2 weeks, we spent time looking at the figure of the older son who stands on the right side of Rembrandt's painting, and talked about what it might be like to experience or feel some of the emotions and things that he did. This week, we're going to take a look at the last figure, or the last prominent figure in the painting, and that is the figure of the Father. And so, friends, as I read our scripture, read the parable of Jesus to us once again, I want to encourage you to take some time and to reflect on the painting before you, and specifically looking at that figure of the Father and what sort of emotion or what sort of things speak to you out of that painting. And we'll discuss those after the scripture is read. So hear these words from Jesus. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put him on, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found.' And so they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in, so his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all of these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. You never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and was alive again. He was lost and is found.'" So friends, what does the painting, and specifically the figure of the Father, evoke in you this morning? Patience. Okay, yes. Anything else? What's that? Welcoming. Okay. Anybody else? Pure love. Absolutely. Forgiveness. Excellent. Well, friends, we've begun just to touch on a few of the very important aspects of this father figure. A couple other things that I want to draw your attention to is, again, to remember that the father and the younger son are where often our eyes are drawn to, right? They're sort of the center of the painting, and yet they're not in the actual center, but it's where the most light comes down in that painting. I also want you to notice that the light specifically centers right on the hands of the Father, right? Those hands that are upon the Son, okay? And that goes back to what we just talked about with some of the young disciples, and we'll spend some time looking at those hands in a minute. I also think it's intriguing that the depiction that Rembrandt uses is a weathered old man, right? This sort of crouched over figure. His eyes seem a bit dim, almost as if he can't completely see as he used to be able to, but there's definitely a softness about him, a sense of compassion that wells up, and we get this from the stillness of this. And so everything in the painting really seems to come together in this character of the Father. And so, friends, one of the things I want us to do again is to put ourselves in the shoes of the Father and to think of what it must be like to be a father who has two sons who have wandered from home. And that, in fact, might be a little bit better title for this parable, right? The father that has lost two sons. And so, Marianne, if you just move me there. And so, again, this might sound a bit redundant because we've talked about this, it seems like week after week. But again, we remember that both sons wander from home. One takes his inheritance and just leaves everything behind. The other one has left internally. His heart has wandered away from home, even though he's been in the presence of the Father. Now, friends, I have to say that earlier, when I've looked at this parable, I've always identified with the two sons, right? But as I've been working through this, I've really spent some time thinking about what it must be like to be the father. And what would it be like for me if one of my children, or both of my children, or all of my children decided to leave home in some way, right? What would happen? How would I react if one of my sons said, you know what, Dad, I really don't care about you. Just give me my share, give me what's mine, and I'm out of here. I can't wait to leave this house and go do life on my own. Or what's it like to have the resentful son that says, look, I'm chafing under your household and all of the rules and everything that you have here, and I'm just disgusted. I feel like a slave. And friends, I just could say all I could think about was the fact that my heart would break, because it would mean that both of my children have missed my heart. Okay? And the beauty of this parable is not this strict, stern, patriarchal father figure who just is concerned with his power and his status. But yet we see the nature and the characteristic of God, of this father figure who constantly keeps an eye out for both of his sons, right? For the one who has gone and wandered off, he's constantly surveying the land, constantly looking, hoping to see this son return. And when he finally spots him, he's able to identify him directly off the bat, and he runs out and he meets him. Now again, friends, in a Middle Eastern Jewish custom, this is not something a father would do, especially when he's been treated with the disdain and the disrespect that the younger son had done to him. All right? The idea of the father kind of picking up his robes and running out is just something that would have been taboo in that culture. And yet this is the image that Jesus tells us is what God is like. It's what the Father's like, that he'll run out and look after that wayward son, that one that he has, even though in that disrespect has ran away from home, he runs out and says, look, welcome back. I'm so glad you're back. And I don't care what you've done. I'm just glad to have you back. And he does the same thing for the elder son too, right? He hosts this big celebration. He's all excited to have one son back, and he realizes that the elder son is nowhere to be found. And out of his generosity and his love for the other son, he goes out and says, look, why are you out here in the darkness? Why don't you come into the light and let's celebrate? This brother of yours who's lost is found. We have him back safe and sound. And then he gets stung with the bitter, harsh words of the elder son who says, look, I've been a slave for you all of these years, and you just don't care about me. And this son who disrespected you and took all of your inheritance or all of the family resources and ran off, you welcome him back as if nothing had ever happened. But the father says, look, I love you just as much. I don't love you less because I'm throwing a celebration for your brother. I want you both to come back and to be in my house, to be in my presence. And friends, I can say that as a father myself, I don't think there's anything my kids could do that I wouldn't welcome them back home. I might not be happy with some of the stuff that they've done, but that doesn't mean that there'd be anything that I wouldn't do to get them back home. And so, friends, I encourage us to think about that, because it breaks my heart sometimes when I see some of the damage of broken relationships that go on. And we have, again, some parents who estrange their kids because of things they do. We have some children who estrange their parents because they don't like what it's like to live with, or they think they're too strict, or any number of reasons. But it breaks my heart because of that broken relationship. And I think how wonderful it is that we have a God who will welcome us back, because again, at the end of the day, if we look at ourselves, we all fall short, right? All sin and fall short of the glory of God. And yet we all desire to be welcomed back home, to be accepted for who we are. Now, I also want to draw your attention again to the hands of the father figure, because you'll find something rather interesting there. And if you look at the hands, you'll notice that the left hand appears to be more masculine. The fingers are spread out as if they're almost gripping the shoulder of this younger son. The other hand, the right hand, appears more feminine. It's much more slender and gentle. Its fingers are closed almost as if it's caressing the child or this younger son. Now, some scholars have drawn attention to the fact that the gentle hand is on the side of the younger son where the sandal has fallen off, essentially speaking to this idea that, look, there's been a hurt, there's been a wound, there's something traumatic that has happened, and this hand consoles that part of him. And yet there's the masculine hand on the other side that says, look, you know what, you've been through some hard stuff, but you're going to be able to continue on. You're going to be able to keep going. I believe in you. I love you. And friends, again, we can think about that in terms of our own relationships. Now, I can tell you firsthand that when something happens to my children, they fall and get hurt or something happens to them, I'm not the first person they run to be consoled, right? Unless I'm the only one there, okay? Most of the time, if mom's there, it's a beeline right to mom, because she's going to pat them and hug them and tell them everything's going to be all right. She's going to bandage up the wounds. I'm going to look at them. I'm going to dust their knee off and say, look, you're all right. You're a tough kid. Get back out there and go do stuff again, right? That's just kind of the way it is. But as I thought about these hands this morning, and specifically these fatherly hands that I have, it amazed me this week how many times I found myself touching my kids. Right? Just this constant awareness I had of, again, just putting a big old paw on them just to let them know that I'm there, just to let them know that I love them. Now, there are a couple of times that I would have liked to maybe squeeze their neck a little bit and wring it because of some of the stuff they did, but nonetheless, it's interesting to see that. And friends, one of the things that this parable, I think, in this picture too, highlights is this idea that God embodies both the masculine and the feminine, the role of fatherhood as well as motherhood, okay? And I think as we look to see that, it's wonderful to know that God transcends so many of the areas that we sometimes get caught up in. And we see here a father figure who also has mother characteristics, a God whose love embodies each and every one of those things. Now, friends, the other thing we highlighted was the idea of this divine unconditional love. And again, in our painting, this comes together in the centered nature of this father figure. And again, friends, it's difficult for us to comprehend unconditional love because as human beings, we're just not capable of doing it for any length of time, right? We're faulty, and even on those people we claim to love the most, we still find ourselves struggling because we still sometimes put conditions on people, right? Now, I believe we can experience unconditional love to certain degrees and in certain ways in our lives, but until we are perfected in glory, when Jesus comes again or we go up to be with God in heaven, only then will we truly experience it in its fullest nature. Now, friends, this embrace, too, again, this unconditional love says, you know what, there's nothing that you can do to make me not love you. It doesn't matter that you've wandered from home. It doesn't matter that you've squandered the family resources on prostitutes and wild living. It doesn't matter that you're out in the field and you're angry, you're bitter, and you're deep in resentment. Here's the thing. I love you in spite of that or despite of that. I want you to come back. I want you to come in and feel my hands upon you. I want to give you a hug and embrace and for you to be in my presence. All right, and again, if you'll look at the father figure, I love how his cloak and stuff almost creates this archway, this protective barrier over the younger son, right? And he just pulls him in deeply into his bosom. All right, and so, again, think of how many of the Psalms that we hear of God being our protection, of being our refuge, of being our shield, our strength, and our fortress. And again, there's that deep masculine sense of God protecting, standing over us, protecting us from the things that are wrong, but there's also the feminine compassion, the gentleness to console us when we're there. And again, someone mentioned the willingness to forgive. And friends, again, this is where we sometimes go to in fault, is that we become unwilling to forgive. We're not able to truly express that unconditional love, right? And one of the things that I get concerned about in the church is that oftentimes we can point to certain sins and we can highlight those things, and yet we're not willing to forgive. Because here's the thing from the story. Does God point his finger at either one of the sons for the sins that they have in their lives? No. The first thing God does is to welcome them back in and say, you know what? I love you and I accept you, even though you've done some very wrong and bad and evil things. And friends, I can say the same thing. Thank God we have a God who's willing to forgive us. And in my own life and in my own experience, one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes the biggest areas of my sin are not the first things that God works on. All right? Because sometimes there are things God says, you know what, we got to clean this area up before we can get to this issue. And when we sit there and we point at each other's sins, sometimes we do nothing but create guilt and shame for that person when God is actually working on a different part of their life. Now, don't hear me and say that there shouldn't be accountability and that there aren't things that we need to hold strong to. But again, the first response is to welcome. It's to forgive and say, look, I've done some things wrong too, and God is working in redeeming those things in my life. He's cleaning those out, and I've had to come to repentance. And as we allow God to do that, we find then that the sin gets dealt with on God's timing and not our own. But the fact that God is willing to forgive us for all things, past, present, and future. And so again, I invite you to take one final look and to consider the nature and the characteristics of the Father, of God. And the last thing we're going to talk about today is confronting comparison. And we talked about this a little bit last week in the elder son. But one of the problems with comparison is that we become so obsessed with ranking and dividing each other that we either can't experience God's unconditional love and his forgiveness, or it prevents us from offering and allowing other people to do that. And friends, I have to say I was really convicted in this last week as I sat and I thought about this and thought about how many ways I compare myself to other people, how many ways I rank other people and consider them worthy or unworthy, right? And I've listed just a few of them there: intelligence, attractiveness, success. That barely scratches the surface of all the ways that we've designed to compare and contrast with other people. And friends, one of the things that worries me is that when we do that, it leaves us with the question of, do we measure up? All right, and we see that specifically, I think, in the elder son, right? He just keeps wondering and saying, life's not fair. Look, I've done all this stuff, but it looks like you care about this younger son more than you care about me. I don't get it. But comparison also creates tension within our own relationships. Because when I compare myself with Kyle and with Phyllis and with Dale, all of a sudden, I have to move myself to a position where there's tension in those relationships, right? Because now it's either I measure up to them or I don't measure up to them. And what happens? If I'm better than them, then I can look down on them and be superior. If I don't measure up, I can be resentful and say, well, I can't do what they do. But here's the thing. God looks at both of his sons and says, look, I don't love you any more than I love the other one. I love you both the same. That's part of my unconditional love. Friends, I also went back this week and I spent some time reading another parable, and that's the parable of the vineyard workers. And if you remember that one in Matthew 20, it's the story of how the owner of the vineyard goes out in the morning and he hires a whole bunch of workers for a certain wage. And then noon comes and he goes out and he hires a whole bunch more workers, but he pays them the same as he did for the workers he hired in the morning. And then just a couple hours before it's quitting time, he goes out and hires a third batch of workers, and he pays them the same as what he did for the first one. And there's parts of me, people, honestly, that just screams, that is not fair. That's not the way life should be. There's just something that I swear, I just want to kind of rip that page out and say, that's not the way it works. All right? But that's my misunderstanding of God's nature, right? The idea that I can't see God as a good and a loving and a generous God who says, you know what, look, I'm going to hire you at this early in the morning to do this work, and you agreed that this was a fair wage for the work you were going to put in. But I'm also generous enough to say, look, I want to give someone else an opportunity. I'm going to hire them, and they agreed to that wage, and they thought it was fair. And I'm also a generous God who went and hired somebody right before dark, but because I'm generous, I gave them the same wage because they only got to work for 2 hours, and maybe they really needed that to support their family. And so, friends, God does not compare us to anyone else. He doesn't divide and rank us. He looks at each and every one of us. He looks at our hearts and said, you know what? I've made you unique. I've made you special. You are my beloved, and I love you. And I accept you for who you are. Doesn't matter what you've done. Just come to me. Be in my presence. And so, friends, we need to be very aware of how often we compare ourselves with other people. And we have to be aware of the tension and the conflict that puts on relationships. Just to give you a very sick and embarrassing example from my life. So I just went down to state, and I don't even want to share this because it just sickens my heart. But was down there and watching these kids that I've coached all year, and I honestly, for a little bit, had a desire for some of them to lose so my son looked better than some of the other ones. And I caught myself thinking that and comparing these and going, oh my gosh, Josh, how ugly is that? That you would want someone not to succeed, someone that you've invested how many hours in training and coaching and trying to raise up, and inside, internally, you're so ugly and you're so competitive that you want them to lose. All right? And so, friends, think of the tension and conflict that resides even within us when we do that. And think of what that can do when that begins to manifest itself outwardly into our relationships. And so, boy, I had to really swallow down some ugly stuff and I don't know how you say it, metaphorically fall on my knees in that moment and go, God, you got to get this crap out of here, because this is just not good stuff. And so, friends, again, are we going to emulate the Father? Are we going to be willing to put our arms around those wayward and lost people, no matter who they are? Maybe they're people that were very dear to us. Maybe we're related to them, or maybe they're complete strangers, but will we have the compassion, that love, and that forgiveness to say, look, I don't care what you've done, just come be with us. Be in God's presence with me. Let's celebrate. So because I was so long-winded last week, I'm going to cut it short this week, but I've got a couple of action steps for you. The first one is to spend some time in reflection. And does the depiction of the Father in the parable and in the painting match your understanding of the nature and characteristics of God? And if not, why not? And maybe how does your heart need to change so that you can see the Father, to see God the way that Jesus presents him in these parables, of the shepherd that goes out to seek the one that's lost, of the person who cleans the whole house to find that special coin and then rejoices, and then the Father who celebrates the homecoming of his children. Practically, this week, I want you to emulate the Father. Seek out, invite, and welcome those who have wandered from home. I also encourage us to extend forgiveness and love to others. My friends, God bless you.